Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County. I am joining you again to continue talking about plant propagation. In the last presentation we did on this, we talked about propagating from seed, propagating by division, things like bulbs and corms and roots. And today I would like to talk about cuttings and grafting. I'm gonna go ahead and get started with cuttings. Taking a cutting is just removing and rooting sections of a parent plant. And we can do that at different stages of growth for the stem that we're going to be removing. So we may be removing herbaceous stems. We may be using softwood, semi-hardwood, or hardwood stems. And we'll talk about the differences in those. We can also use root cuttings as well as, in some cases, use leaf cuttings to propagate plants. So things that are really important when we're considering taking cuttings is that the timing of taking those cuttings, as well as the type of tissue that you're going to use for that, vary really widely between the types of plants that you are propagating. And this can present a significant challenge, particularly for home gardeners, and to be honest and straightforward with you, for me as well, because we want to really make sure that we're doing this not only at the right time, but with the right type of tissue for the kind of plant that we're going to be propagating. Now, there are some tools that can make propagation a lot easier. One of these is rooting hormone, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. But rooting hormone does just what it sounds like. It helps promote rooting for the plant and can really improve our success in making these cuttings. Another thing that's really important when we maintain cuttings and just for plants in general is we really want to make sure that we're maintaining good soil moisture for the plant and maintaining humidity around the plant. The plants that we're propagating from cuttings aren't going to have a really well-established root system. They're going to have difficulty maintaining the water balance that they need. And so maintaining a humid environment around that cutting can be very important to its success. And so often when we're taking cuttings and rooting them, we will suggest that you cover the plant over to kind of create a greenhouse environment for that. And there are clear plastic containers that you can use for that. Even in extreme, using a clear plastic bag can surround that cutting and just increase that humidity to provide for or to allow for greater success in making those cuttings. One thing that, of course, is important is the type of media that we use to grow cuttings in. If we just try to use soil out of our backyards, that soil tends to pack too tightly, make it difficult for those new roots to form, particularly when it's wet. And in addition to this, we have wounded the plant by making that cutting. And it's possible that our native soil is going to introduce some of the diseases that can affect that plant and result in death of the cutting. So some materials that are particularly good for use as a propagation media for cuttings. First of all, just clean, coarse construction grade sand is a material that you can use. It is a good idea when just using a coarse sand to heat sanitize that prior to when it's used. There are a couple of different approaches to that. One of the simplest one is putting it in the oven for a short period of time at a low temperature, just to potentially kill off any bacteria or fungi that might be present in that sand. It's also possible to mix that clean sand with an equal volume of peat moss, which just improves the water holding capacity of that material. A very common material that's used as a propagation medium is vermiculite. You can see a picture of vermiculite up as the top picture on this slide. It's essentially an inert material. Doesn't really absorb water very well. And we often see this used as kind of a spacer in a lot of soil media or soilless medias that we would purchase to grow container plants. Similar to that is perlite. And you can see perlite being used in the bottom two images here. Perlite is a rock material that's exposed to heat to expand it. Again, it can be mixed with an equal volume of peat moss. You can additionally use compressed peat pellets. We often see those in bags at our garden stores. You add water and they expand outwards, and you can place the cuttings down into those. Once you have rooting on that cutting, once we have the rooting and we're ready to move on to the next stage, we still want to make sure that we're taking really good care of those newly rooted plants. And so kind of as the next step, as we move from that propagation medium to the next stage, we want to move those plants into a container, and any good potting media or soilless media that we would purchase or make ourselves that's designed for houseplants is perfectly suitable for potting these newly rooted cuttings, just taking care of them as they're establishing really well before we move them off to wherever we want to take them. Now, I did mention rooting hormone. Rooting hormone, in most instances that we're going to encounter it, is going to be in a small bottle and usually be kind of a talc material. So a very fine white powder is what you're going to find inside of that container. These rooting hormones are essentially a synthetic version of the plant's own hormone that just promotes the growth of roots. If you look down at the ingredients, the vast majority of them are going to be inert, but there is some of that hormone. Usually it's indole-3 butyric acid, or IBA, but there are a few other products that have different rooting hormones that work basically the same way. And to use these rooting hormones, we very simply just dip the material into, or dip the cutting down into that material. We want to make sure that we have a little bit of, we make sure that material will stick to the cutting. Tap off any excess. We don't want there to be too much, but we want to make sure that it's kind of liberally coated on the bottom. And importantly, because that is a kind of a physical material or a powdery material, when we stick that plant down into the medium that we are using, we want to make sure we make the hole either with a pencil or with our finger so that rooting powder doesn't get knocked off the plant when we do that. And I do see several questions in the chat area asking whether rooting powder gets old. And yes, it can, particularly if it's exposed to heat or if it's kind of left out in a bad environment. That rooting powder can be less effective over time. I don't have a specific amount of time that it would last for. Generally speaking, I use a fair bit of it. So I replace my rooting powder every year, and that tends to work well for me. But if you are going to keep it and use it continually, it's a good idea just to keep it in a climate-controlled area to prevent it going bad on you. Just to talk about some different forms of cuttings, I want to start off talking about herbaceous cuttings. And these are made from non-woody herbaceous plants, things like geraniums or chrysanthemums, poinsettias. And we want to take these cuttings from mature growth. We want to, at the end of a stem, we want about a 3 to 5 inch piece of stem cut from the parent plant. And one thing that just kind of applies universally when we're taking these cuttings is we want to make this cutting as clean as we possibly can. having a very good sharp tool and a clean tool to make that cut will increase your chances of success. We don't want a tool that may have been exposed to some plant pathogen, and we don't want a dull tool that's going to crush that stem when we cut it. We don't want to do any more damage to that than we have to. So when we have that 3 to 5 inch piece of stem, we want to take the leaves on the lower half of it, just and remove those. And one of the reason why we want to remove those leaves is, again, we're really trying to preserve the water balance for that plant, allow it to take up the water it's going to need. And leaves are where the plant transpires, where it loses that water. So removing some of those leaves is really going to help us with keeping that water balance for the plant. Now, the good thing about herbaceous cuttings is they tend to be relatively easy to root. Very often, they don't require rooting hormone, though we do see faster rooting and an increased number of roots when we do use that rooting hormone. And very often, these cuttings will root relatively quickly. Softwood cuttings, kind of the next step up from those herbaceous cuttings. We're going to be taking these from new growth on woody plants, really just as it begins to mature. And sometimes there can be some confusion between what is a softwood cutting and what is a semi-hardwood cutting. And really the best way to make the decision that this is the softwood that you want to take, as well as when you're going to be taking that, is the shoots that are really good for making those softwood cuttings can be snapped really easily when they're built. But very importantly, you still see a gradation in the leaf size. So when you look at that stem, the older leaves or those lower leaves are going to be mature and at the full size that we expect for that plant, while the new leaves that are on there are still going to be small. So for taking a softwood cutting, we want to select a stem that has at least 2 to 3 nodes. I would suggest a minimum of 3, and make a bottom cut just below a node. Similarly to with a herbaceous cutting, we want to remove those leaves from the lower 2/3 of the stem, remove all the buds, and remove the terminals. That removes the end as well. And again, you want to make sure that we're maintaining moisture for this. When you're cutting, if you're not putting them in to root them immediately, it's a really good idea to put them in a cooler, to put them in an area where they're going to be in really high humidity, just to prevent them from drying out, and keeping a water bottle around to mist them regularly is also going to be very important to success for these cuttings. Semi-hardwood cuttings are going to be taken from partially mature wood that is this current season's growth, and that we're going to see that just after they have had their flush of growth. And really the important thing here is that their leaves should all be of a mature size. And that's what's going to be our indication that we have our semi-hardwood ready for those cuttings. This is used on a variety of our different broadleaf evergreen shrubs that we very commonly have in our landscape, camellias and hollies, as well as some conifers. Those cut stems, again, 3 to 5 buds. Generally speaking, we're going to have those 5 to 12 inches long. And the distance between those buds, or the internode space on that stem, is going to vary, between plant species as well as the conditions the plant's grown in. One thing that is useful when we are trying to root these semi-hardwood cuttings is to wound the base of the cutting. And I'll show a picture of that when we talk about hardwood cuttings, kind of give a better idea. But what we're doing is we're just exposing a little bit more of the cambium tissue down at the base of that cutting to provide a little bit more area where we may see some of that rooting. And as we go up through from softwood to semi-hardwood into hardwood, the cuttings take more and more time to produce the roots that they need. So we need to be a little bit more patient with them, make sure that we're taking care of them, keeping them in a humid environment, potentially misting them, and it's just watching them carefully to ensure that they're being taken care of. And you know, having several of these, or as many of you as you possibly can, allows you to check one or two to kind of see the process and the progress of that plant forming those roots. Our last one we're going to discuss is hardwood cuttings. Hardwood cuttings are taken from dormant mature stems, and we tend to take these cuttings in early winter. So at this time, we generally have a plant that's fully dormant. We don't have any signs that it's growing, and that wood is going to be firm. It's not going to bend easily for us, so it's a good stiff stem. So we often use this for deciduous shrubs, those plants that are going to lose their leaves in the winter. So some examples of that would be fig trees, grapes or privet, privet occasionally ligustrum, called ligustrum. And hardwood cuttings can, again, be much slower than what we see for softwood or semi-hardwood cuttings, just taking a little bit longer to root, and far more advisable to use a rooting hormone when we're working with these plants, as it tends to speed up that process. So the process of taking that hardwood cutting, we want to cut off a stem, again, formed over the past summer, 3 to 5 buds immediately below a node. And we're not going to be rooting these immediately. So it's a good idea to take a pencil or take something else, a piece of rubber band, anything that works for you, and just mark that the bottom 2 inches of that cutting. You know, usually you can take a look at a stem and kind of see which direction it goes by looking at the buds to see which way they face. But occasionally that can that can be a little bit of a problem. So we want to make sure we mark which side the bottom is, because we don't want to put the top end into our propagation media. Once we have them marked, we can store those in a container. Use moist peat or perlite. Keep them in a cool area until spring. At the spring, we want to remove the buds from the bottom 2 inches. We don't want those to grow as the plant is rooting. And then again, kind of like we would for the semi-hardwood cuttings, we're going to wound that bottom 2 inches of the stem to increase that surface area for us to start that root development. And you can see an image of that kind of in the center of the screen, a really good sharp blade cutting into that stem to expose more of that green area where we're going to get root formation. We will see some callus tissue forming prior to the spring. That's those sort of undifferentiated cells that are going to form down there at the bottom. And we want to apply rooting hormone to that lowest 1 inch of the stem, put it into a damp propagation mix, right up to that pencil line that we made, firm that in around it, and just really take care of it. It can take a significant amount of time to get those roots to form successfully for these hardwood cuttings. Going on to root cuttings, kind of a different process, or a different section. And really, I consider this as much a form of division as anything else. And I talked about root divisions in our previous talk. But you know, we will occasionally use root cuttings for plants like blackberry or bleeding heart that are difficult to establish from stem cuttings, and they'll perform a lot better when we use these root pieces. We usually do this during the dormant season, but really you can do it at any time. And we just dig up that root ball, cut it into 2 or 3 inch sections. Keep it in a really good moist media. I would suggest, if you're taking these root cuttings, that the best thing to do is just get them back in the ground as fast as you possibly can. Unlike a lot of the other cuttings we're going to be doing, we're going to place the roots horizontally, kind of the orientation that that root would naturally be. And we'll see the formation of those new stems coming up off of that root. Um, Say there on the slide to replant 2 to 4 inches deep, that's going to be really dependent on the plant that you're working with, how deep that root cutting needs to be. It is possible if you've got a really thick root, you can put those vertically with the end of the cutting that would be nearest the crown or nearest the top of the plant when you took the cutting pointed up. Very similarly, this is cane cutting. And my experience with this is largely from sugar cane, as opposed to the sort of house plants that are being described here. So Dieffenbachia or corn plant need to have that kind of cane-like growth that we can cut into segments, and each of those nodes on that cane can produce roots and produce a shoot. So again, we're going to be putting that horizontally in the soil for the most part. Um, it's going to contain several buds, and we'll start to see those roots forming at each of the nodes of that cane, as well as stems coming up off of the growth of that cane. Just again, need to make sure that we're maintaining our moisture, maintaining good humidity when this is forming, to make sure that that plant that's been cut has the time that it needs and has the water resources that it needs in order to form new roots. Lastly, several different kinds of leaf cuttings. Oftentimes we're going to use leaf cuttings where taking stem cuttings may be a little bit difficult. If the plant has a really compressed growth habit, where there's nodes are just really close together, it's possible in some cases to just use the leaves. And we may be using a whole leaf, or we may be using sections of a leaf in order to do that. One of the great things about leaf cuttings, particularly for houseplants, as long as we have good leaves on that plant, we can really do this at any time and have good success with that. So in some cases, we are taking whole leaves. You can see a picture down at the bottom. We do want to trim that petiole down, just the little stem that leaf is on. You can apply a little bit of rooting hormone right to that petiole, sink it right down into the medium, so the base of that leaf blade is right in contact with the soil, and then that petiole will have the root formation. You'll start to see new plantlets being formed. Plantlets, just a really small little plant. And then as that forms and as they start to mature, you can very gently separate them out into individual containers and develop the new plants from there. Now, there are some plants where the leaf just arises right there from the stem, so you aren't going to have a petiole to work with. And in this case, when you take the leaf off of the plant, just put the 1/3 of that leaf that's closest to the stem when you took it off down into the soil, again with a little bit of rooting hormone, and the bottom of that will again start to develop those roots. One thing about leaf cuttings is that they are very sensitive to excess water. So we want to be really careful in how we're providing water to them. We don't want to provide too much because we can start to see those leaves developing problems and rotting as a result of excess water. Using leaf sections is another interesting way, and I think this makes a really great project for working with young people. Is you can take individual leaf sections and root those. The classic example of this is snake plant. So you cut off one of the leaves right at its base, and then you cut it into sections, and each of those sections can be planted to produce that new plant. Just dip the bottom of that, and again, make sure that you kind of keep the orientation of that leaf in mind. Dip the bottom down into rooting hormone, Put it about 1 to 2 inches down into your rooting mix, and just again, really carefully watch your moisture level, and you'll start to see the formation of the roots right there on the base of that leaf section. All right, before we get into grafting, I want to take a moment because I mentioned that one of the difficulties in taking cuttings and having success with propagation with cuttings is finding the right time for the particular plant that you're working with in order to take the cutting when it's going to be most likely to be successful. So I'm going to share my screen in a slightly different way, and that's going to allow me to bring up a web page here that will hopefully let me show you just a resource that I think is really useful for figuring these things out. I'm having just a little bit of technical difficulty, so I appreciate your patience there for just a second. And I am going to ask that one of my, if you don't mind, over in the chat area, making sure that we are seeing what I have now on my screen. I would appreciate you letting me know, just to make sure that I'm showing you exactly what I would like to. But what I have here is a list. This is from the North Carolina State University Extension Service. So I am borrowing this from them and from their website, just because it's a resource that I thought was particularly good. And there are a variety of other examples that you can find like this online that give you these sort of lists of common plants and what type of cutting is most successful. So you can see here we have the common name of different plants, its scientific name, because very often as we're talking about different plants, particularly in different parts of the country, we may have different names for the same plant. And I really commonly have run into that, even moving from northern Mississippi down to South Mississippi. I've encountered that I may have a different common name for a plant than people who grew up in this area. You can also see type of cutting that generally be successful, and they have it divided by softwood, semi-hardwood, and hardwood there. And you can just kind of go down the list and select the different plants that you might be attempting to propagate, and see what kind of propagation is going to work well for you for that particular type of plant. And you can see, it's not a incredibly extensive list, but there are quite a few different plants on there that are commonly grown in the home landscape, whether here or in North Carolina. So that's just kind of a good example of one of the resources that you can find if you are looking for, when should I take cuttings from a particular plant. And of course, I will encourage you to contact your county extension office, and you can always ask there as well, as a way to just ensure that we're taking those cuttings when it's going to have the best possibility of success. So there's a lot of similarities between grafting and cutting. So in grafting, we are taking a shoot and a root system from different plants and joining them together so that they will form together into a single functional plant. And we are essentially relying on the way that plants heal in order to form that join. So between the rootstock, which is the plant that is going to be serving as our root system, and the scion, which is what we're propagating onto that rootstock or the upper part of the new plant. Those two plants are forming callus tissue that's joining together and forming one single plant as a result of that. We'll also occasionally hear budding talked about as something separate. It's really just a grafting technique where instead of taking a stem to graft with, we are taking just one single bud, and we will talk about that just a little bit. So there are some interesting reasons to use grafting. There are some plants where it's very difficult or even impossible to get them to reproduce true to seed. Or they may not be able to reproduce at all, or they may produce a plant that just doesn't have the same qualities. In some cases, particularly for large-scale commercial fruit orchards, um, different varieties come into fashion over time, or different varieties are developed that have improved qualities. And we can use grafting as a way to establish these new varieties without having to sacrifice the established root systems that have been growing for quite a while. There are also some good examples where trees require a pollinator. They're not self-fertile. You may need a male tree and a female tree, and that can be inconvenient or difficult to work with. And so you can simply add a pollinizer branch into the established tree. So adding a male branch to a female tree in order to provide that pollination without having to have that male plant there. Another advantage is oftentimes the rootstocks that we're using have sort of improved qualities. So we may get disease or insect resistance as a result of using those root systems. And going back to the example of apples, actually taking on some of the qualities of that root system and dwarfing the plant so it doesn't grow as tall and is just better for the landscape use that we're using it for. Similar to that, we may get certain plant forms we're interested in. So plants with a weeping growth habit. Sometimes we want that good tall center stem, and then finally that weeping growth habit. And using grafting, we can get the best of both worlds there. It's also possible to use grafting as a repair. If the top of a plant gets damaged, we can essentially replace it. And just for entrance or for interest rather, grafting can also be used as a way to create fascinating designs in the landscape. And this can be very attractive and very interesting. You can see an example there on this slide of grafting being used to create these interesting plant forms. In fact, there are some artists where you can see their work online that specifically kind of work in this as their medium. And I think it looks really interesting in the landscape. So there are some things we need to make sure we're taking care of to make sure that we get successful grafting. One of the things we really need to make sure of is that we have a compatible scion and rootstock. They need to be related enough in order to be able to form that graft union. And how related they need to be is really just down to the different plant groups. And it's a good idea if you're looking at grafting a particular plant and to really go and look and see what rootstock is used for that, as well as where you're going to be able to get that rootstock. Of course, we do need contact between the cambium layers across that graft because we need that production of interconnecting xylem and phloem cells. Those nutrient and water transplanting cells for the plant really have to get connected together so that we make sure that we have a successful graft. We do have to have some form of pressure, essentially holding that plant together. And that's just required to prevent them from, the rootstock of the scion from moving independently, because we have to have that continuous bridge of new cells being formed And not only that, they need to be oriented correctly. They have to be arranged properly for those organized cells to develop. And lastly, similar to with cuttings, we need to make sure that we're avoiding the plant drying out or desiccating. So those fresh cuts lose water very quickly, transpiring through the foliage or other growth. So that really will be down to when we're going to time our grafting, as well as the use of materials to really kind of hold that water in and prevent the plant from drying out. So when we are collecting our Scion wood, these are again, the sort of the top plant, top growth of the plant. Generally, we are going to collect that from last season's growth. And we're going to cut that into 4 to 6 inch lengths that have 3 to 4 buds. One thing that is really important, we want to bundle them together and make sure that we label them carefully, because we don't want to be like me and find a bundle of Scion wood and wonder what plant this was that I took it from. It's a good idea to seal the ends with wax. You can use just pruning wax for this, because that wax tends to melt at a low temperature to prevent having issues where if you're just using beeswax or just using another material like that, you can actually burn that plant material if the wax is too high temperature. You keep them moist, store them in a garbage bag, keep them in the refrigerator until you're ready to use them, and we can get on with the process of grafting. That being said, with all of that, often, some of these forms we are using our graft material a little bit more quickly. Whip and tongue graft, probably the kind of graft that I have the most experience with. We can use this on a wide range of fruit and ornamental trees, nut trees. It is important when we're using whip and tongue grafting to match the rootstock and that Scion wood, to have them be of equal size. And generally, we want them to be about a 1/2 inch diameter or less. I think anything less than a 1/4 inch starts getting really difficult to cut accurately. Once you get up to about a 1/2 inch, it's just difficult to make this work. The advantages of whip and tongue grafting is you can kind of see over in the image, there is a lot of surface area of that outside tissue of the plant, that cambium tissue, in contact, so that allows a lot of space for that new union to form. The other advantage is that by having a second cut, there's some natural compression that happens that really stabilizes that graft and keeps it from moving around. So it makes it a little bit easier to maintain. So when we're making a whip and tongue graft, we're going to make two separate cuts on each piece of wood. The first is going to be a sort of long sloping diagonal. That can be anywhere from 1 to 2 inches long. And of course, we want to match these two cuts between the stock and the Scion. And that's really where sometimes we have a little bit of difficulty, is we really want to make sure that the angle that we cut on both parts of the wood are going to be the same, and that's going to meet up. Our second cut is going to start about a third of the way down from the top of that first cut. You can see that in the sort of leftmost image there on the screen. And we're just going to cut down into that plant, and that's our tongue cut. So we've made identical cuts between the stock and the Scion. You can see there, again, back on that image on the left, how we're using that tongue to kind of meet up and hold that graft together. After that, we want to really carefully wrap it in grafting tape. My preference there is parafilm, and we'll talk a little bit about tools for grafting at the end. But you want to make sure, again, that you cover it really good and wrap it up in grafting tape. You may cover the outside of that with wax in order to prevent any desiccation that you might get in the graft. Another form of grafting that I have frequently used I've been informed that it's kind of a less common method these days. Usually we're going to do this several feet up from ground level. We're starting with an established tree to serve as our rootstock. And essentially we're just cutting the end of that rootstock, either the stems of it or even down to its base. And because we're cutting that much, we can change that new variety over. We can actually get multiple varieties on a single tree, so you can wind up with your fruit salad tree. Or we can also use this to install pollinizer branches. And we're going to be, unlike where we have a whip and tongue graft, where we're matching to a scion and a rootstock of equal size, our rootstock in this instance is going to be much larger than our scion. So that larger stock might be 2 inches, it might be significantly larger than that. Whereas our scion wood is really going to be in that 1/4 inch size. So again, a big difference there. Generally speaking, for cleft grafting, we are going to be doing this in early spring, just as that rootstock is starting to become active. Our scion wood, we want to take several weeks earlier, or when that plant is fully dormant, just again to kind of slow down any transpiration or other problems that we might have. And by having that difference, it really allows for a lot of callousing from the stalk, but we don't see that leafing out in that scion wood, and so we have kind of less water stress because of that. Here's a little bit more about cleft grafting. Again, really using it on well-established trees. So we can select several branches on that tree to be cleft grafted. We want to start off. You want to split that root stock really carefully, kind of right down the center, and you can see both images here where that process has been done. You're going to cut that scion wood into a really long, kind of abrupt V shape or very long V shape, and insert that into the stalk. And the important thing on this insertion is, and you can see this really well in that top image, is you want that cambium tissue on your scion wood and the cambium tissue on your rootstock to be meeting up when you insert that wood. And generally, you will insert 2 scions when you do this, so one on either side of your rootstock, which the benefit there, in my mind, is that you get twice as many plants, you get twice as much chance to get the kind of formation and healing that you're looking for to be successful in making these cleft grafts. Another kind of grafting, again, really common, this is bark grafting. This is another instance where our rootstock and our scion wood are going to be very different in size. So our branches or rootstock is going to be at least 2 inches in diameter. Again, we're usually doing this in late spring, and part of that is because during that period of time, it's a lot easier to get that bark to kind of move away from the center of that plant. So we cut out the top of that rootstock tree, just like we would in making a cleft graft. So either a branch or even the base of the tree, but we're not going to split that stalk right down the middle. We're going to, over on the side, make a cut downward on the bark right into the hardwood. And do that on either side, so we can essentially pull back that bark and insert that same V-shaped scion right down in there, and then use that as our way that we're getting that graft union. It's going to probably be the only time I ever tell you that it's okay to drive a nail into a tree, but it is fairly common to take a 2 or 3 inch nail, whatever is appropriate to the size of the plant that you're grafting, and nail that in through the graft, through the wood part of the graft, in order to just hold it in place. And again, we want to make sure that we cover all of that exposed area with or any cracks that are formed with grafting tape. And similarly to cleft grafting, we don't want to just do this once, around the circumference of that rootstock. We can place several of these scions in order just to ensure that we have a little bit increased chance of success. For flap grafting, I have often experienced as a challenge. It is used on pecans. Usually we're collecting the scion wood deep into winter in January, and the grafts are done kind of in what I would consider early spring in May. Kind of depends on where you are for that. So we're cutting that round piece of scion wood. It really needs to match the diameter of our rootstock, but we're going to cut it, into a square shape by making 4 individual cuts. You can see that really clearly down there at the bottom, how that scion wood has been cut into those 4 pieces. And then from the rootstock, we're clipping off the end of it, making 4 cuts again to kind of peel back the bark into those long, thin strips. Another name that I've heard for this form of grafting is banana grafting. I think because of the way that you have those strips of bark arranged. And then we're going to insert that scion right down there into those remaining pieces of bark after cutting out the center of the rootstock. And again, seal that up very carefully with grafting tape or wax. Bud grafting, again, as we mentioned, we're going to be transferring individual leaf buds to the stem of another plant. We're generally going to be doing this during the active growing season, so from June into early September. And ideally, we want to do this earlier rather than later. June is far preferable to later because that's going to allow a lot more time for that plant to heal up and to really get a good new, sort of new established graft in there. So some examples of approximately when you would want to target this are right there. So for peaches, you're looking at Memorial Day to about the 1st of July. For apples, about sort of the end of June into very early August. And for pears, the 4th of July into the middle of September. So tea budding, what we normally think of, or what I normally think of when I think about bud grafting, you're going to make a T cut on the stalk, just a cut right there in the shape of a T, clear area of the stem, away from any buds, so kind of right in the middle of an internode. Make a vertical cut down the length of the stem, about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, and then about a 1/2 inch slit across the top, right until your blade meets the resistance of the wood later. And the tricky thing for me in doing this is to very carefully pull that bark away using your grafting knife to free up that kind of T-shape to be able to insert that bud in. So to cut the bud away from the plant that you're using to graft on, or you're grafting from rather, you cut it, start cutting about 1 inch below the bud, come up underneath it, and let your end cut be about a 1/2 inch above that bud. Oftentimes we'll take a 6 or 8 inch section of stem that we're going to use to take those buds from, and that is a good practice when you're getting started doing this, because doing those cuts can be a little bit tricky in order to do successfully. One thing that is good is that you can kind of leave that little petiole or little piece of stem right there on that bud, and you can actually use that as a handle as you insert that into the T-cut on the stalk. Close those flaps down of the T that you've made, and firmly wrap that tape around there to close that incision, and let that bud take. A little bit more successful in my mind, has a little bit more challenges as well, as chip budding. We can do this a little bit later in the fall because we're not worried about being able to pull that bark away from the plant, which is the part of tea budding that I always have difficulty with. But we do get a really good bud union this way. The difficulty here is just making sure that you get a good alignment of the stock and of the scion. So what we're going to be doing again, remove any large leaves or flowers from the portion of the shoot where you want to do this. Have a good clear area to work with. And you're going to make 2 cuts into the rootstock or the stockwood. So starting, high, you're going to cut, from the top downwards, drawing the knife through the bark into the wood. And you can kind of see that there in that top image, or you can look at the picture of the rootstock there in that bottom image to kind of get an idea of what we're doing. And then we're going to make a second cut down near the bottom where your first cut ended, really steep, and just cut into where you have made that first cut, kind of at about a 45-degree angle, and that allows you to remove that little section of your rootstock. You're going to make your cut on your scion wood really exactly the same way, doing your best to be able to match up the size of that donor bud that you're going to be putting into that rootstock. It is a good idea to collect those sticks early in the day. Leave the buds on there and cut them as you're going to be using them. Store them in a good dark, cool place until you're ready to take those buds off. We do want to really make sure that we get the cambium aligning. So the cambium from the rootstock and scion really need to touch. If they're not exactly the same size, we don't want to put that chip bud in the center. We want to make sure that we at least have one side of that cambium tissue in contact to make sure that we have time where it's going to be able to form together. Again, wrap that really well, grafting tape and or wax to make sure that it's not going to desiccate, and keep an eye on it. Again, talking about time of grafting, most of it is going to occur kind of in the early spring when we have our sap flowing. There are some plants that just specific to them can be grafted when both of them are dormant. Usually budding we're going to do in mid to late summer. So you really want to pay attention, kind of like for cuttings, we need to make sure that we're going to use the form of grafting and the timing of grafting that's going to be particularly suitable for the plant that we're working with. There are some tools that are really useful for grafting. The first one, of course, is going to be a grafting knife. You can see that over there in the top corner, top left corner. Usually they come with 2 blades. One has a little bit of a hook to it. The other has a very flat blade. Has a flat end, usually with a little indentation, so you can kind of use it to pry with very gently when you're working with the wood. There are a variety of kind of products out there for grafting tape or for grafting wax that are, again, really just used, again, to hold that scion wood in contact with the rootstock. My preference is for parafilm. I just find it easier to work with. But if you're getting into grafting, if you've not done it before, I suggest you try each of them just to find the one that you have the easiest time working with, that you're going to be the most comfortable with, because that's the one that you're going to be most successful using. I do think it's notable that, I really do need to, again, make sure you keep your grafting tools clean, particularly your grafting knife. You don't want to transfer disease, or if you have oil or any dirt on your knife that gets into that graft, that can cause a problem for you. The other thing that I will note is please be careful when you're making the cuts for grafting. I have cut my thumbs a number of times doing this. So be really conscious of how you're working with that knife to make sure that you're being safe and don't make the mistakes that I have. One thing that has come out a little bit more recently, this is a grafting tool that you can purchase. Essentially works like a pair of shears, and it cuts a very uniform shape into wood. It's really good for small stems and small grafts. But you can see, it comes with options of a V cut or a U cut, or kind of a what we call an omega shaped cut, that can be very useful and very quick, and kind of gets around one of the real difficulties of just making sure that we have those cuts even between our scion wood and our rootstock. So they usually sell for somewhere between $30 and $50, depending on the model that you purchase. If you're interested in getting started with grafting, it's not a bad way to do it. You can just kind of simplify the process for some of those smaller stems that you might be using. All right. Well, I appreciate your time today. I appreciate